What usually happens is then the math, if it's a good theory, it tells you the limits of that theory. Einstein's theory, when you combine it with quantum theory, quantum field theory, tells you very explicitly that space-time has no operational meaning beneath 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, the Planck scale, and 10 to the minus 40. So what's interesting, the philosophers will say this is self-refuting again. There's a theory of space-time in which everybody believes space-time is fundamental, and it comes out and says, no, space-time isn't fundamental. It doesn't even make sense at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and below. Well, that's the way science works. A good theory comes back and tells you its own limits. That's the glory of science. And it's not self-refuting. It's in the nature of theories. Gödel tells us that it's in the nature of theories that no theory can tell you all the truth. It is no theory of everything. And a good theory is one that tells you where the concepts that you use to boot up the theory reach their limits. And then what you do is you look for a deeper framework, and you show that the old theory, so you don't throw away your old theory, but you show how the old theory is now a special case of a deeper framework.
Donald Hoffman is a cognitive psychologist, a professor at UC Irvine, and author of the recent book, The Case Against Reality, where he makes the case that evolution may not have tuned us to see reality as it is. Donald Hoffman's works on perception and consciousness are incredibly important and interesting to dive deep into. Here, we talk about his interface theory of perception, the idea of looking at perception as a constructive interface rather than a window or some traditional metaphor. We talk about finding structures deeper than space-time and what implications that has for consciousness. Talk about consciousness and consciousness theories, as well as a bit about contemplative spiritual traditions and what role they might have to play in this whole conversation. As an aside, if you like these conversations and would like them to continue, please consider subscribing to the channel. That really helps us out. I wouldn't ask you to like it. I think that's a bit too far. Here is my conversation with Donald Hoffman. How did you become interested in perception?
Well, I took some courses at UCLA when I was an undergraduate, upper division courses, where I started learning about visual perception and found the visual neurophysiology quite interesting. I was stunned to hear all the amazing properties of the receptive fields of neurons in visual cortex. And then my senior year at UCLA, I found out about the work of David Marr, who was a professor at MIT in the Artificial Intelligence Lab and what's now the Brain and Cognitive Science Department. And his work seemed to really integrate, of course, good knowledge of neurophysiology because he had a PhD in that, but also trying to build systems that actually could see. So actually to build working visual systems. And I thought that was a really good combination to understand the visual neurophysiology and then to also then understand the artificial intelligence side of things. So that really grabbed my attention, and I went to MIT. I was fortunate to get to work with David for a while at MIT and the AI lab there, and so that was what really grabbed my interest. So it was some good classes when I was an undergrad at UCLA.
Right. No, David Marr's three levels of analysis, amongst other things, just seem like it has to be right.
Yeah, I like his three levels of analysis: the computational theory, algorithm, and hardware implementation kind of idea. I think that that's a really good intellectual framework to think about a lot of problems. And Marr, he was a genius, and he was a wonderful advisor. Also, I was co-advised with Whitman Richards, who was at MIT there, and so the two of them were just wonderful advisors. And Marr's book Vision was a landmark in the whole field of visual science. So, and the group that he assembled there at MIT was stunning. I was very lucky, and I knew at the time I was very lucky to be at this pivotal point in the history of visual science. So yeah, it's Marr really his good writing was what grabbed my attention as an undergrad and sort of moved me into the field. I was interested in this whole area anyway, but Marr really sort of he brought it all together and got all my interests. So that's why I went there.
Was it that Marr's work expanded the sort of the bridge between theory and practice here? That Mars work provided a framework for how you could start building systems and sort of transcend the boundaries between computer science and neuroscience.
Yes. So, I mean, I was very impressed with what the neurophysiologists were finding, but there, as we know, that there's billions and billions of cells in the brain and in the visual cortex, billions of cells there. So, uh, that's understanding what they're doing is very, very difficult. And I'm not interested in, people just waving their hands and saying maybe this, maybe that. And what I loved about Mars' approach was there was this no nonsense approach. If you think you know how it works, build it. And if you can build it and it works, then maybe you're onto something. If you can't build it, I have no time for your ideas. And I thought that was exactly the right kind of no nonsense idea. So anybody can speculate about how systems might work or how the visual system is working, but if you turn that speculation into a working system, it doesn't mean you're right, but at least it means you're probably serious enough that we should look into what you've done. So I like that hard-nosed attitude.
Right, right. Okay, so diving into the meat of your work. Um, so what is the interface theory of perception, and how did you come up with it?
Well, so the interface theory of perception is very, very different from what my advisor David Marr had in mind, right? So Marr thought that for simple systems like the fly, the visual systems probably had evolved just to give simple signals that guided, the motor commands to the wings and so forth, but no real insight into the nature of objective reality. So they weren't their visual systems weren't there to show them the truth. It was really just the strict guided adaptive behavior kind of attitude that you'd expect from evolutionary theory. But Marr thought, and in his book Vision, he talks about this, that he thought that in the case of humans, we'd evolved and been shaped by natural selection to see, for example, the true shapes of surfaces, of objects around us. So, and also the distances to them. So Marr thought that we were seeing the truth when we saw objects. I mean, to see that there is an object would be seeing a truthful thing, and seeing the shape of the object and the distance, we would, in the normal case, be having a veridical perception. Of course, he understood that we could easily have misperceptions now and then, but he thought in the normal case, we saw reality as it is. and he was my advisor, and I believed him for many, many years. But as I started to look at evolutionary theory a little bit more closely, it became clear that evolutionary theory does entail that sensory systems evolved to guide adaptive behavior. That's clear. That sensory systems that help you survive long enough to reproduce will be more likely to evolve than those that don't. So it's there to guide adaptive behavior. So Marr's claim, and the claim of many of my colleagues, that in addition to what evolution tells us clearly, that sensory systems evolve to shape our sensory systems, evolution shaped our sensory systems to guide adaptive behavior. In addition to that, saying, in addition, they've been shaped to see the truth. That is an extra claim that when I thought about it, wasn't obvious. And the more I thought about it, it became problematic, because guiding adaptive behavior is clear. Seeing the truth is something people are just adding on to that. So I decided at some point to look into that. And I first, I wrote a book called Visual Intelligence: How We Create What We See. And so I looked at in detail at how we construct shapes and colors and so forth. I didn't talk about evolution too much in that book, but it was in the back of my mind. But after that, I decided in around 2006, 2007 that this was a big enough issue in my field, and my concerns about the standard view that we see reality as it is weren't being addressed in a rigorous manner. And evolutionary theory is a mathematically rigorous theory, so we shouldn't just wave our hands and say what we want. We should get some theorems. So I decided first just to run some simulations. So my graduate students and I in 2010 published a paper in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, where we ran some simulations that confirmed that my initial idea was that, well, maybe, you know, seeing the truth would just be too time consuming and take too much energetic resources. So evolution does things cheaply and quickly in many cases because it takes less calories and less time. So, so it wasn't a very deep idea, but I thought, well, if we've been shaped to do things quickly and cheaply, maybe we cut corners and we don't see the, you know, we wouldn't see the truth. Um, and it turns out that that's the case. But our simulations tipped me off. One of my students, Brian Marion, was the one who really pointed this out to me. That what was really the interesting thing, of course, you know, the doing things fast and quick and cheap was fine. That did make us cut corners on the truth. But the real thing was that the fitness payoff functions that guide evolution might not have information about the true structure of the world. And when they don't have information about the true structure of the world, then when you're shaped, you know, when your senses are shaped by a fitness payoff function that has no information about the structure of the world, then your sensory systems won't be able to be shaped to that structure of the world because there was no information to shape them to that. And so that was the real tip off. Okay, so some fitness payoff functions might not have information about the structure of the world. Wow. In that case, we wouldn't see. So what's the probability? What's the probability that a fitness payoff function that's shaping the sensory system will have information about the structure of the world? And that seemed like a pretty important. So I went and worked with mathematician Chetan Prakash and some other colleagues, Manish Singh, Robert Prentner, Chris Fields, and others. And we looked at this. I should also thank Jeff Iverson, who'd been a big help in some of the mathematics on this, and Justin Mark, who did some of the simulations. So I don't want to leave anybody out here. There's a lot of, so it wasn't me, it was a whole team of us. But what Chetan and I really worked on was, what is, okay, can we give a general argument? What's the probability that a payoff function will have information about structure in the world, like a total order, like the percentage of oxygen in the air might be 1%, 2%, 3%. That's a total order. 1, 2, 3 are numbers that are totally ordered. So a total order or a metric or topology, there's all sorts of structures that the world might have that you might want a sensory system to be tuned to. So could we frame a combinatorial argument about this? And we did, and it turns out that the evolutionary theory gives us no reason to prefer any one payoff function over another. Right, and I should say a payoff function depends on the state of the world, right? Whatever the world might be. It also depends on the organism. But what's good for me is not good for a benthic fish, and vice versa. Being 5,000 meters underwater is really bad for Hoffman. It could be really great for a benthic fish. So the payoff is going to depend on the world and the organism, the state of the organism, whether you're hungry or, for example, or not hungry, and what the action is: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. The famous 4 Fs. So they're complicated functions, but evolutionary theory just says there is some fitness payoff function. It puts no restriction on the nature of that payoff function. Now, a future version of evolutionary theory might, but right now, there is no restriction on these functions. So what we decided is, okay, let's suppose the world, whatever the world is, we don't need to assume we know what the structure is, but the world has n, say m states. So m is in Mary, and our fitness payoff values might be from 0 to 100. 0 means you're dead. 100 is the best possible payoff. And so n is in Nancy possible payoff values, and we can then literally count the number of payoff functions. Right? So it's n to the m possible payoff functions. And then you can, for any particular structure in the world that you might think about, so say a total order, you can then say, out of these n to the m total payoff functions, how many of them are what we call homomorphisms of the structure in the world. So say a total order or topology, whatever it might be. And you can count them, right? If you do the math, you can count them. So then you can just put the total number of the homomorphisms, the ones that have information about the structure of the world, put that in the numerator of a fraction, and put the total number of payoff functions in the denominator, and then take the limit as the number of states of the world goes larger and larger to infinity, and the number of payoff values goes larger and larger to infinity. And you get a clean answer in every case. The probability is 0, precisely. That a randomly chosen payoff function would be a homomorphism, that i.e. have information about the structure in the world. So it's a pretty devastating argument, right? That how could evolution shape our senses to see the truth if the fitness functions that are doing the shaping don't know the truth themselves? Almost surely they don't know the truth. So now I'm not saying that that's the final word in evolutionary theory. Someone could propose a change to the theory of evolution by natural selection. They could say, well, here's this new principle that we need to add to evolutionary theory that shows that there's a bias, that the fitness payoff functions that we're likely to encounter are biased toward ones that see the truth. Now, I'm perfectly open for someone to make that extension, but that is not our current evolutionary theory. There is nothing like that on the table. So if someone wanted to make a concrete proposal, they would have to give a principled reason why there is this bias, and I've not seen that on offer so far. So as it stands, with our current evolutionary theory, the probability is 0 that any sensory system of any organism has ever been shaped to see any aspect of the structure of objective reality. And notice I don't need to know what objective reality is, right? And this argument also, I mean, a counter that I get to this argument is Hoffman, you're refuting yourself. Evolutionary theory assumes a physical world with organisms that are physical objects and things like apples that have definite properties and shapes, and so you're using evolutionary theory, which assumes that we know truthfully that there are organisms, and knows truthfully that there are resources like apples, and we know truthfully that there is space and time and so forth. And you start with that, and so you have to be refuting yourself if you use that theory to conclude that we're not seeing the truth, and so that the whole thing about objects in space-time is, and my answer to that is, and I should say that, I mean, this is not just casual. I mean, there's a philosophy PhD who, part of his dissertation last July or June at UC Santa Cruz, took this on and argued that I have to be self-refuting because I have to have false beliefs. If I believe that the mathematics of universal Darwinism, which is using evolutionary game theory, so it's the mathematical model of evolution. If I believe that if I don't believe that is a good model of evolutionary theory, then of course I shouldn't be able to use it to get my conclusion, right? So, but if I do believe that the math is a good model of evolutionary theory, then evolutionary theory is an instance of this mathematics. So it's a good instance of this universal Darwinism. Then I'm committed to the ontology of evolutionary theory. And so I'm going to refute myself when I end up denying that ontology. And my answer is, it doesn't matter what Hoffman believes. That's irrelevant. Well, there's a mathematical theory on the table. It's called evolutionary game theory. There's evolutionary graph theory. Now, is it the final word? No. It's the best word we have so far. So as a scientist, for better or for worse, I'm saying this is what science has to offer right now, evolutionary game theory. Do I believe it? Irrelevant what Hoffman believes. Who gives a rip? Who could care less what Hoffman believes about the ontology of evolution or the evolutionary game theory is? Who gives a rip? All I care about is there's this mathematical theory that's out there. It's the state of the art. It's the best we got. I want to look at the structure of that mathematics. and see what it entails. Does it entail that there's a high probability we're shaped to see reality as it is or not? And when you look at that mathematics, the answer is very, very clear. The probability is zero. And by analogy, take Einstein. Einstein believed in space-time. He thought space-time was fundamental. And in 1905, he put down the equations for flat space-time, special relativity. And in 1915, 10 years later, he put down the equations for curved space-time. And he believed space-time was fundamental and smooth and so forth. But we found out when we took his equations and used them with even just his equations alone, we found that all space-time isn't smooth. It could have black holes. Einstein didn't expect that. He didn't like it. He didn't believe it for a while. So Einstein was not a believer in the output of his own equations. So that's the way science works. You don't need to give a rip about what the individuals believe. Look at the math, look at the implications of the math. That's how we move forward. So this bit about, well, you have to be, your beliefs are important and you can get yourself in logical conclusions. No. That's not how science works. Your beliefs are your beliefs, and you get your ideas over beer, wherever you might get them, from watching Netflix. You get your beliefs, and the bottom line is, who cares? You get a mathematical theory. Now the math is there, and the math is there with its own implications, and you look at it. And what usually happens is then the math, if it's a good theory, it tells you the limits of that theory. Einstein's theory, when you combine it with quantum theory, quantum field theory, tells you very explicitly that space-time has no operational meaning beneath 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, the Planck scale, and 10 to the minus 40. So what's is interesting, and the philosophers will say this is self-refuting again. There's a theory of space-time in which everybody believes space-time is fundamental, and it comes out and says, no, space-time isn't fundamental. It doesn't even make sense at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and below. Well, that's the way science works. A good theory comes back and tells you its own limits. That's the glory of science. And it's not self-refuting. It's in the nature of theories. Gödel tells us that it's in the nature of theories that no theory can tell you all the truth. There is no theory of everything. And a good theory is one that tells you where the concepts that you use to boot up the theory reach their limits. And then what you do is you look for a deeper framework. And you show that the old theory, so you don't throw away your old theory, but you show how the old theory is now a special case of a deeper framework. So I think that I would love to find a deeper framework in which evolutionary theory evolves as a special case, and also a deeper framework in which space-time evolves as a special case. So we don't throw away those theories. We keep them as special cases that were really important guides to the later work.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, just the question that you put forward, I think it can't be dismissed, right? That people might disagree with things like the weight of the functions or the specific strategies and how you model them. But just the base question that evolution should have something to say here, that there's a question of whether trade-offs have some homomorphism with structures out in the world, is a very clean question. And it's a question that it's a falsifiable question. It's a question that can be empirically answered. And that has something to say about how we see the world.
Absolutely. Now, the best pushback I've gotten from scientists, not the philosophical pushback, that this has to be self-refuting. You couldn't possibly get this from evolution. So I think I've answered that kind of philosophical pushback. From the scientists, the pushback that I get lots of cranks, but for the real scientists that really have some ideas, the cleanest idea I've seen from them is something along the line of, well, what if you have tens of thousands of fitness payoff functions, and they're coming at you fast and furious? You wouldn't have time to be tuned to any one fitness payoff function, and so maybe in that case you might be tuned to the truth. And there have been some simulations and so forth to try to show that that's the case. It's interesting first to notice that the move here is not to say, well, no, most fitness payoffs are going to shape you to see the truth. They're sort of conceding that they might not. So what they're doing then is trying to make the fitness payoffs almost irrelevant. which is almost against the entire spirit of evolution. The whole point of evolutionary theory is there are these fitness paths that guide evolution. So their gambit is, well, let's throw so many fitness paths at you that they couldn't possibly guide your evolution. So maybe your sensory systems won't be shaped by fitness path functions. So, it's an odd gambit because it sort of cuts against the whole spirit of evolutionary theory. But that aside, it still misses a.
It's also challenging the best math, the best tools that we have to model this, right? I mean, game theory, genetic algorithms, perceptual strategies just are the cutting edge that we would use to answer this.
Right now, these scientists that propose this understand what you said. They would agree with you on that. But what they were trying to do was to sort of make the fitness payoffs be irrelevant almost to your evolution, because there were so many of them that you couldn't be tuned to any one of them, and that way they could get around my argument. And so I know these are smart people, and so what you said is absolutely true, and they understood that. But here's the point that we plan to publish in response. We've got a paper in reply, and that is, it's true that we face tens of thousands of fitness payoff functions, and what do we do with them? We create data structures that we call physical objects. So when I see an apple, that's a data structure that encodes all sorts of potential payoffs for certain actions I might take. If I'm interested in mating, well, the payoff from an apple is very, very low. Trying to mate with an apple is not going to work. If I'm interested in eating and I don't have an allergy to an apple, then that could be very, very good. If I'm interested in fighting, moderate. I might be able to throw it like as a weapon and hit someone in the head, but it's not a very good weapon. And so for any object, so now if I have a sword, right? So now a knife is, well, it's not very good for eating, not very good for mating. It's good for fighting. So what we do is we have all these different fitness payoffs, and we take them and we do hierarchical clustering. We take all these weird fitness payoff functions, which could have all sorts of shapes. We cluster them, hierarchically cluster them into useful units, and we call those units objects. And so every time I look around, now I see, a car. Now I see an apple. Now I see a person. Now I see a shoe. Every time I look, I'm seeing a new cluster of fitness payoffs, perhaps hundreds of fitness payoffs, all wrapped around what I call an object, and it's guiding. So yes, we do see thousands of fitness payoffs, and they're changing all the time. So these are they're absolutely right. These arguments are absolutely. We have thousands of them. So what do we do with them? We don't ignore them. We don't just ignore them. We use them to create these data structures that we call physical objects. So physical objects aren't the truth. They're useful data structures to handle exactly the problem that these people are raising, these researchers are raising.
Right. Okay. So this view of looking at perception, having that shift from looking at perception as this window or camera snapshot, as you like to say, to a constructive theory. Has this been? Do you think this is more and more mainstream now? Do you think this is more and more accepted now, or there's still challenges to this?
Well, I would say this: that no one has disproven the theorem. So we have a theorem that's published, and we have simulations, and the only counters so far are some simulations of the kind I just said, where people say throw thousands of fitness payoffs, and in that case, effectively you ignore the fitness payoffs and you're to the truth. So that's why we do have to publish a paper where we say, well, but that's not the only strategy that you would have in evolution for having thousands of fitness payoffs, is to effectively ignore them. Why don't you use them? That's what evolution theory is about, is using your fitness payoffs. Why don't you use them to create data structures that we call objects and deal with this problem that way? So that's the strongest pushback that we have. No one has pushed back on the fitness payoffs. Almost surely don't have the information about the structure of the world. That's pretty devastating. And again, I should say, my own attitude is, I'm not doctrinaire about this. If someone can come up with a theory of evolution that's different where there's a bias on the fitness payoffs such that they are biased somehow to have certain structures in the world. Bring it on. I'd love to see it. But my attitude is also that the physicists independently have decided that space-time is doomed, that space-time is not fundamental, which is stunning because physics until recently has been about what happens in space-time. That's what physics was. So some physicists have actually said, so it's not really clear what physics is about now, but it's pretty exciting. I mean, they're not scared or worried about it. The younger generation is boldly going beyond space-time and finding structures like the amplituhedron and decorated permutations and so forth. So they're space-time is doomed. Thank you very much, space-time, for everything that you gave us. And now it's time to move on and find new structures, which of course have to project down to space-time. So we're not throwing space-time away. We need to do our tests where we can, which is in the space-time data structure. Well, that's where we can get our empirical data in space-time. But the physicists themselves are saying space-time isn't fundamental. So when you get evolutionary theory saying our perception of space-time and objects is not veridical, it's just a headset, it's just a user interface that guides adaptive behavior. And then the physicists say, you know what? We took Einstein's theory of space-time that assumes space-time is fundamental, and that theory itself says space-time isn't fundamental. So when the two big pillars of modern science, evolutionary theory and quantum field theory and general relativity, are agreeing that space-time isn't fundamental, maybe it's time for us to move on. Maybe it's time for us to look for structures beyond space-time. And that then, of course, has huge implications for theories of consciousness, because basically 99% of theories of consciousness that are on offer today just assume as a matter of course that space and time are fundamental and objects in space and time are fundamental. Even the so-called functionalist theories, which in principle don't require any particular physical instantiation. If you actually, for example, integrated information theory, you could think of it as a functionalist theory. It doesn't require space-time. But if you actually ask the people who are using it where they think is actually being instantiated, it's in space-time. It's neurons or circuits or what any physical system that has the right integrated information. They're not looking for instantiation outside of space-time. They're not looking for ectoplasm or angels or anything like that to instantiate the integrated information. So if functionalists have some instantiation beyond space, beyond or outside of space-time that they're thinking of, they haven't let on. So I would say that functionalists, physicalists, and even panpsychists approach to consciousness all have this problem.
Do you see that to be the case with all the consciousness theories? So IIT, global workspace theories?
Basically 99% of them. It's I would say 99% of the theories out there, even the dualist theories, are assuming that space and time is fundamental, but then also something else in addition to space and time is fundamental. So they get that part wrong. So if you get the physics wrong, if the physicists are telling you space-time isn't fundamental, and then the cognitive neuroscientists and so forth come along and say, well, we're going to take space-time as fundamental in our theories of consciousness, well, good luck. I mean, the experts have told you don't do it, and here you are doing it. I mean, you're in some sense, that's not good naturalism in science. If you ignore the experts in that, in physics, and you say, we're going to do it anyway, that's not naturalistic. That's recidivistic. So I'm a naturalist. Let's take our best science. The physicists say it's over for space-time, so it's over for space-time. Great. So neurons don't create consciousness. Physical systems like artificial intelligence circuits or software don't. I mean, anything inside space-time is not fundamental, so it can't be the foundation for consciousness. Great. I mean, that's the glory of science, is to take our deepest assumptions, smash them to pieces, and say, look somewhere else, look further, look deeper. And so that's what we need to do.
Right. So just to linger on this for a second for the audience, oftentimes when people talk about space-time not being fundamental, people kind of chalk that off to not being as important as it is here, in saying that, well, space-time is emerging out of some deeper structure. It might be anything, but it's still physical enough in that it all connects. But that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is more fundamental than that. It's that space-time is is part of this construction that we have, and unless we deal with that, we won't be ready to address what's real underneath.
That's right. That's exactly right. And my attitude is cognitive neuroscientists like me who are studying consciousness should listen to the physicists when they tell us that space-time has no operational meaning at beyond 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. There's nothing to rescue it. And they're finding these new structures like positive Grassmannians, amplituhedra, and the deepest is like something called a decorated permutation. And they're saying there are these structures that are beyond space-time. They're beyond quantum theory. So it's not like forget space-time, but well, let's stick with quantum theory, and build up space-time from quantum theory. No, they're saying there are no Hilbert spaces out here. We found structures beyond Hilbert spaces, beyond quantum theory, like the amplituhedron. And the volumes of the amplituhedron actually code for what are called scattering amplitudes, like the probability that 2 gluons hit each other and 4 gluons go spraying out and so forth, that colliders, like the LHC. So the volumes of these new structures code for the scattering amplitudes. The geometry of them, their facet structure, codes for properties of spacetime like locality and unitarity and so forth. So you find these structures beyond spacetime that project down to spacetime. So spacetime, so these structures are really complicated, high dimensional structures. Sometimes they're polytope. The amplituhedron is not a polytope, but still, they're these high dimensional structures. They project down to this little four dimensional space-time, 3-dimensional space, 1 dimension of time. Or even string theory is not deep. I mean, it's 10 dimensions. These structures go many, many more dimensions than that. So it's a new game in town, and it's only, by the way, it's less than 10 years old. So my colleagues in cognitive neuroscience can be forgiven if the amplituhedron's only been out for 9 years. Well, so they can be forgiven for not having jumped on board for the latest hype. Many physicists aren't even aware of this stuff, so why should I be ragging on them for? But ultimately, my colleagues who are studying consciousness, and these are my friends. They're brilliant. But if you have the wrong foundation, doesn't matter how brilliant you are, you can't solve the problem. So I'm hoping that my brilliant friends and colleagues will really pay attention to what the physicists are telling us and let go of this reductionist point of view, which like Nima Arkani Hamed at the Institute for Advanced Study is very, very clear. Reductionism is dead. The idea that as you go to smaller and smaller scales in space, you find more and more fundamental laws and more fundamental entities governed by those laws. That reductionist view has been a wonderful guide for quite a few decades, maybe few centuries. But we now have a principled understanding that is over. Reductionism fails. We know that it can't go beyond 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, and it actually fails well before that. So we have to, my colleagues are brilliant, and I would like their brilliance to actually have a chance to solve this problem. So we have to let go of space-time because that's what the physicists are telling us to do. And so that's what I'm doing with my collaborators, where we let go of space-time. We have a theory of consciousness outside of space-time, and we're using decorated permutations that the physicists say are the deepest structure they found as our connection to build up space-time.
Right. And just to be clear, like reductionism may still be helpful in some situations, so long as you have a well-defined enough problem. I know you make the distinction between taking reality seriously versus taking it literally. In that a reductionist approach lets you deal with a train that's coming at you, but it's not going to give you truths about the universe.
I completely agree with you. I mean, reductionism, for example, reducing temperature to mean molecular kinetic energy in statistical thermodynamics. Wonderful. And there's no reason for us to, I mean, when we let go of space-time and so forth, we're still going to want to, that's a beautiful result, and we'll want to show it as a special case of a much deeper theory, and we'll want to understand why the appearance of reductionism worked in that particular case, but why, in some sense, it was lucky that it worked. And when we get to a deeper framework, we'll understand why reductionism is, in general, not Correct, because space-time itself is just a data structure. It's not the fundamental nature of reality, and it has, a limited scope. It's, by the way, it's a very shallow data structure. 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. If it was 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters, I'd be impressed. 10 to the minus 33, pretty shallow. I'm not impressed at all. So it's, and yet it's got a real grip on our imagination. So
Is this is this devastating for you, like personally, existentially, aside from scholarly occupations? Is this troubling?
very much so, for reasons in part that the uh, child psychologist Piaget pointed out. That he thought that Piaget argued that when we're about, I don't know, 17, 18 months of age, we get what he calls object permanence. We're programmed to have the belief that what we see is really there, independent of whether we see it or not. I see a baby doll. Mom then puts the doll behind a pillow. I believe that the doll still exists and there really is a doll behind the pillow, and I go look for it. Piaget thought that happened at 18 months. Later research suggests that we're wired to do it at 3 or 4 months. So our belief that physical objects exist even if we don't perceive them is not something that we believe because we rationally came to that conclusion. We believe it because we're programmed to believe it, and it's the way we see the world. And so when something that you believed since before you can remember turns out to be false, that's really, it's unsettling. And so it's been very unsettling for me, as it is for, sometimes when I give talks and people hear me saying evolution, so we don't see the truth, and they got, that's nonsense, and they throw out a couple obvious, ways I must be wrong and self-contradicting. And when I answer them, after I've answered like 4 or 5 of them, then I start seeing like fear and panic in the eyes of the audience. It's sort of like, we might have to take this idea seriously. And if you start to take the idea seriously, it's not like a minor thing, like, the speed of light is not 186,000 miles per second, it's 186 point, it's not some little minor thing like that. This is more like my whole world view has to change to accommodate this. And that's deeply unsettling. So I've had to spend, actually, even to do this research, I have to spend a lot of time, like, just quiet to even think this way, because it's we're not programmed to, at least I'm not programmed to think this way. It's very, very unsettling. So when people have a hard time with it, hey, I'm right there with it. If the math weren't there forcing this conclusion, I'm not sure I would have gone there myself.
Right. And I mean, it's even worse for you because you don't have to just live with it. You have to integrate it into your intuitions in actively doing your work. It's not just a try to accept it and deal with it.
That's right. And so, and I must say, so I talked about the downside just now, that it's been a shock to the system. On the other hand, I do find it exhilarating, because it's sort of like, okay, once you get over the shock, and you learn that it is possible to imagine things outside of space-time, right? So a lot of times when I start talking about this to my colleagues, they have a hard time even knowing what I'm talking about, to talk about structures behind space-time. So do you mean it's like some smaller structure inside space-time, they're really tiny? What could you possibly mean it's outside space-time? So so you have to really wrap your head around the idea that space and time is just a data structure, and we don't have to think of ourselves as confined to that structure and it's the final reality. We're free. We have the intellectual capacity to think entirely outside of space and time, and look for structures beyond space and time and project them down to space and time. So once you get over that and you realize it is possible to do it, it's exhilarating, because it's sort of like, it's, wow, it opens up a whole universe of possibilities. And then all of a sudden, in retrospect, now space-time looks like this real simple straitjacket. I used to think of this vast everything, and now I think of it, as I said before, it's actually a somewhat shallow, limiting data structure. and we don't have to have our conceptions limited to it. We can go beyond it, and so I find it very freeing. So it's it's disconcerting because one of the concrete implications of this is if objects are just data structures that we create and they only exist as we create them, right? It's like a virtual reality headset. When I look at, I'm playing a game. When I look over and see another player, or I see a car or something in the virtual reality, well, I render it when I look, and when I look away, it's gone. There is no car in the supercomputer that's running the system in that metaphor. So the idea that things are created and destroyed on the fly, and that's what objects are. They're little data structures that we create. That means that's true of my body and my brain. I don't have a brain right now. I don't have neurons. Neurons only exist when you render them on the fly. Now, there is something that exists, but it's nothing inside space and time. I mean, our physics is very, very clear. Space and time is not fundamental, and it's clear from evolutionary theory. So space-time is a data structure. That means we're rendering neurons when we need them. And so I don't have any neurons right now. If you looked in my head, you'd find neurons. But that means that neurons are causing none of my behaviors. So none of my behavior is caused by neurobiology. Now, my attitude is, of course, I think we need more money for neurobiology and neuroscience, because this means that neuroscience is much, much harder than we ever thought. We thought you look in the brain, you see neurons, there are neurons. No. You look in the brain, you see a data structure that's pointing you to a much, much more complicated world. Neurons are just the shell. Behind the shell is this incredibly complicated world that we have to unpack. So we need so neuroscience is really going to need a lot more funding, because we it's not as easy as we thought, and we didn't think it was easy. So it's really stunning at a lot of levels. So yeah, it's emotionally quite a roller coaster. I spend time meditating to deal with the personal side, like okay, I'm not this body. So what am I? How do I reconceptualize myself, or can I reconceptualize myself if I'm not just this little thing inside a body, inside of space-time? So it really, once you go down this rabbit hole, if you're going to be consistent, if you as a scientist, I want mathematical consistency. I'm not saying my mathematical theories are the final word. No. So I'm not saying I have the final truth, but I'm not going to be inconsistent. I have no interest in being inconsistent. And so it's now inconsistent with our best science to think that I have neurons, or to think that neurons cause my conscious experiences or my behavior. That's just inconsistent. Neurons are a data structure that's pointing to some other deeper realm beyond space-time. The best the physicists have found are decorated permutations and amplituhedra, which are just these geometric entities, or permutational entities just sitting there. There's no notion of dynamics right now. So we're at this really interesting stage where the physicists, it's like the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, where you see the monolith, and all the apes they see this monolith and they're beating on it, and they don't know it. It's just sitting there. And so we have these monoliths like the amplituhedron and positive Grassmannian and the decorated permutations just sitting there beyond space-time. And the question is, okay, who put them there? who called for that? There's no notion of any process or dynamics going on there. Yes, their structures code for the properties of space-time and give you the scattering amplitudes, but why? And there's nothing moving out there. It's just almost like a Platonic world, in the sense that it's just these entities sitting there. So we're definitely not done. The physicists have just really begun the move outside of space-time, and of course they would be the first to say that. They don't need Hoffman to tell them that. They're the ones who are saying that. So they understand that these are the first baby steps outside of space-time, and they certainly understand that there's nothing dynamical in what they've done so far, and I can imagine that they would like something dynamical, although I don't hear them talking about it. So
Okay, so let me ask you the cliche question. I can understand that space-time is doomed, and that there are these deeper structures, amplituhedrons or whatever, other complex topological structure we may find. Um, but but why do you go toward consciousness? Why do you see the link between consciousness?
Partly it's just poverty of my imagination. Um, so it's I have this. We all have the feeling that we have experiences like headaches or smell of garlic, taste of chocolate, sound of a trumpet, um, and we've most of us who are scientists have thought, well, so we need to understand how, for example, a neural activity causes those experiences. And that's the framework in which I was brought up. And all of my colleagues are working in that framework. So somehow we have to figure out the physical basis and perhaps the neural basis in the human case of our conscious experiences. Well, now space-time is not fundamental. So okay, so I'm not going to be booting up my conscious experiences from space-time, and I'm not going to be doing it from amplitude. There's not enough. There's not enough there yet. So my attitude is, and the other motivation is this: it's what I call the stipulation problem of consciousness. My friends and colleagues, and again, these are good friends and colleagues, so there's nothing personal here. They're brilliant, and they're doing great work, and I hope they continue. But their theories, like the integrated information theory, or global workspace theory, or orchestrated collapse of quantum states of microtubules theory, they stipulate that space and time are fundamental. Even IIT, it's a functionalist theory, but all of the instantiations are in space-time. So they stipulate that space-time is fundamental. And if they have some other instantiation, I'd like to hear about it, right? But so they stipulate that. Then they stipulate these functional properties, like the integrated information theory, or the global workspace theory, or the orchestrated collapse. So they have to stipulate, in addition to the physics of space-time and so forth, they stipulate these more functional things. And then they have to stipulate the conscious experiences, because I've asked Giulio Tononi back in late 1990s, and again just a couple years ago, is there any specific conscious experience that you can give me the particular pattern of integrated information that must be that conscious experience, like the taste of chocolate? What is the integrated information pattern that must be the taste of chocolate? It could not be the smell of garlic or whatever. Can you give me even one conscious one? I mean, this is supposed to be a theory of conscious experiences. So what specific conscious experience can you explain without hand wave? None. How about global workspace? None. Orchestrated collapse of microtubules? None. So every conscious experience is also stipulated. So we have some neural correlates, right? So area V4 of visual cortex is correlated with color experience. So if we're going to say, here's this pattern of integrated information in area V4, then you have to stipulate that that's the color red. I mean, because it's not a theorem from your theory. So you're stipulating space-time and its properties. You're stipulating your own functional properties like integrated information, and then you're stipulating the conscious experiences. So my attitude was, Occam's razor says stipulate as little as possible. Everybody's stipulating space-time and their algorithms and conscious experiences. How about I just stipulate conscious experiences? I'll just start with conscious experiences. That means I have some hard work to do, because I don't get to stipulate space-time. They stipulate it. I don't have the pleasure of stipulating it. I have to derive it. So I have to show how space-time would arise from a dynamical sequence of dynamics of conscious agents. And I can't stipulate integrated information. I have to show how, if integrated information turns out to be of value, I'll have to show from a dynamics of consciousness why you would get integrated information. So I can't just stipulate that. So the idea is to stipulate as little as possible. And I started off by saying it's the poverty of my imagination. If space-time isn't fundamental, in some sense, the only other thing around for me to think about is our conscious experiences. One could go deeper in, say, awareness, pure awareness without any particular content. So one can go there, and that's as far as Hoffman has gone so far. Now, I'm not saying that that's the final road. That just shows, how shallow Hoffman's thinking is. But that's as far as I've gotten. And I would love to have someone say, yeah, well, behind conscious experiences and behind pure awareness without any experience at whatever, there is something, being, but, and we, or whatever it might be, that's even more fundamental. So I'm open to that. But my attitude is, conscious experiences are a good next baby step. If we let go of space time, maybe conscious experiences won't be the final word, but it seems like it's a natural next step. And maybe if we do our work there and get a mathematically precise theory, that theory will then tell us why we need to go beyond conscious experiences. Just like Einstein's theories and quantum theory told us why we had to go beyond space-time. Right? These theories that assume space-time then tell us the edge of it. So my attitude is, let's do theories of consciousness, because that seems like it's within our grasp. We can do it. And if we do it right, then our theory itself may help us to see the next step that we needed to take beyond conscious experiences.
Right, and they might be helpful for solving the hard problem, right? Like that. I mean, all these theories are brilliant, and I'm not smart enough to understand all of them, but um, they just don't solve the hard problem yet. I mean, even orchestrated collapse, microtubules, which has important implications for quantum gravity, doesn't definitively solve the hard problem.
Well, yeah, in fact, it can't deal with any one specific conscious experience. It's a theory of conscious experiences that can't explain even one conscious experience. I mean, if I had a theory of physics that couldn't explain even one dynamical system of physics, I would say, well, I think that's not really a theory of physics. You call it a theory of physics, but if a theory of conscious experiences that can't explain one conscious experience, I don't know why it's called a theory of conscious experience. So and again, these are my friends and colleagues, and I'll be hard nosed at conferences, and we'll go have a beer and be friendly and chat about this stuff afterwards. But when we're doing the science, I mean, I have to put it to them and say, look, there's no beef here. There's no specific conscious experience that can be explained, and so and that's true for all these physical theories. And I think the physicists are telling us why. The physicists are saying you'll never get it because space-time isn't fundamental. If you start with something inside space-time, you're starting with the wrong foundation. That's not what's fundamental.
Right. And I mean, moving on to your conscious actor model, I think it's very interesting because A, it is falsifiable principally, and B, it's not a dualist theory. Yeah, the world is entailed within the model. It's totally monist, totally naturalist theory.
Exactly right. I agree with you on both points. It's monist, so there's only conscious agents. It's conscious agents all the way down, and it's not dualist. I'm not saying that this there so and it's not panpsychist. So like panpsychists will say space-time is fundamental, and the particles that physicists have found, like the bosons, leptons, and quarks, those are the fundamental particles. And what's the fundamental nature of those particles, though, is not physical; it's consciousness. So, it's a kind. They might not call it dualism. They'll say panpsychism. But they're shoehorning consciousness into a space-time structure. The physicists are telling us is not fundamental. So we're shoehorning our theory of consciousness into a discarded physics model. Why would we want to jump into something that the physicists have discarded, and not just discarded, but found something deeper, like the amplitude heater? So panpsychism is using a discarded model and trying to shoehorn consciousness into the structure of a model that we now know is actually a very poor data structure and a very shallow data structure. So that's not a promising way to go for a fundamental theory of consciousness. So it's not dualist, it's not panpsychist, it is monist, and it's mathematically precise. And what we're doing right now, we're about to submit a paper for publication probably next month or at the end of this month. What we've done is we've taken the theory of conscious agents and said, okay, the physicists have told us that the deepest structure they found beyond space-time are these things called decorated permutations. So if we want to boot up space-time from consciousness, we need to show how our theory gives rise to decorated permutations. Because if we can do that, the physicists show us how to go from decorated permutations to scattering amplitudes in space-time. So they've done a lot of heavy lifting for us, right? All we need to do, so they gave us a little interface. Here's the interface, decorated permutations. If we can get it, take a theory of consciousness and get it to project into decorated permutations, then they say, okay, well, here's how you build an amplitude from it, and the volume of the amplitude gives you the scattering amplitude. So we can just now study what the physicists have done and use that to go all the way to space-time. So a few weeks ago, we did that. Our dynamics is Markovian. It's the Markovian dynamics of conscious agents. So at one point, I said, well, okay, they want decorated permutations. So surely someone has shown how to assign decorated permutations to Markov chains. So I went and looked, did a search. I couldn't find anything. Maybe someone else will find it, but I couldn't find anything. And I looked at the best players. A brilliant mathematics professor, Lauren Williams at Harvard, who's been working. She knows decorated permutations and is working also in Markov chains. So I really looked at her work to see if she had actually done a mapping from an arbitrary Markov kernel, Markov chain to decorated. And I didn't see it. Maybe she's done it and I didn't find it. But so we decided, okay, we need some new math here. It looks like, what is a mapping from Markov chains to decorated permutations? And that's in our paper. We discovered it's a beautiful mapping. It's completely clean, and we can actually show the relationship of our mapping to the mapping between positive Grassmannians and decorated permutations. So we can show. So that's what this paper is doing, is saying we have a theory of consciousness qua consciousness, not as emergent from space-time or neurons. It's outside of space-time. Just the theory of Markovian dynamics. We have a canonical way of mapping that into decorated permutations, and therefore we get to use all the good work of the physicists to go from decorated permutations to the amplituhedron into scattering amplitudes. So now I just have to read that literature and understand how their part of the story goes. So that's what I'm doing right now. But we've got the map into decorated permutations, and so I'm pretty excited because maybe the physicists will be interested too. It seems like the physicists, maybe they couldn't care less about consciousness. Who knows? But they might care about a dynamical system behind the amplituhedron. That might be of interest to them. So there's just this static structure called the amplituhedron is just sitting there, and there's decorated permutations behind it. But they might, and I would imagine some of them would be very interested in saying, well, is there any dynamical interpretation that we could give that's even deeper than the amplituhedron? Well, here's one offer. I'm not saying it's the only thing that we'll find, but here's an idea that's pretty natural. Once, frankly, this mapping to decorated permutations is work that is collaborative between Chetan Prakash and I, and it didn't take that long. It's once you think about it, it's not that hard. So it's pretty fun.
Sometimes I think the problem is just sort of a conceptual thing where a lot of people, a lot of physicists don't think consciousness is what we're talking about here, right? Like people think of consciousness as this macroscopic property that can only be applicable at a certain level of complexity, but that's not what's meant here. It's a far deeper problem.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that's a really important point. So take integrated information theory, for example, right? They might, I just made the point that they can't explain any specific conscious experience, like taste of chocolate and so forth, but they can come back and say, but look, what we can do is we can use integrated information theory to tell whether a system is conscious or not. So we can't say what kind of consciousness they might have, but it's really a valuable contribution that we can say that this system has the right kind of integrated information complexity to be conscious or not, and we might be able to use that to help patients that are in locked in syndrome and decide whether or not they're locked in syndrome or whether they're really gone, for example, and decide whether you help to pull the plug. But I think that even they're not getting what they think. So their arguing that they're still thinking about consciousness as an emergent property. Once you get a non-conscious system that has the right complexity of functional organization or causal organization in their case, then consciousness somehow emerges from that. Now, but space-time isn't fundamental. Objects in space-time and the complexity of objects in space-time are not fundamental. They're just a data structure. So right now, for example, we're talking via Zoom, and there's pixels on the screen, and some pixels on the screen. So I see behind you, I see a desk, a bookshelf with books and so forth, and they're not moving very much and so forth. And so I could use my little algorithm, Hoffman's integrated information theory of pixels, and say, well, no, the books are probably not animate, but if I look at your face pixels, I mean, there's face, the eyes are moving, the face is moving, you're nodding and you're smiling and so forth. So I could come up with my own complexity measure and say, aha, and I might say these pixels are conscious. The pixels for Ashar's face are conscious, but the book pixels are not. Well, pixels are pixels. And to say that pixels are conscious or not is just a mistake. It's a category error. Some pixels are providing a useful portal into your consciousness, right? I mean, the pixels that give me an image of your face, and your face is giving me some access to, if you think I'm full of it, or if you like what I'm saying, or whatever it might be. So I'm getting some access to your consciousness. So integrated information theory is essentially a theory of the pixels being conscious, and the pixels aren't conscious. And that's really important, because that means that in a medical situation, getting an integrated information score that says consciousness only means that it's showing that we have access to the consciousness. It's not showing that whether or not there is consciousness, right? Those are two very, very different things. It's whether the pixel dynamics is complex enough for me to understand Ashar's consciousness or not. But that's independent of whether Ashar is conscious or not. If the pixels aren't doing it, that doesn't mean Ashar isn't conscious. It just means the pixels aren't up to it. So it's quite possible that we could pull the plug on someone because they didn't have the right integrated information theory. And they could be fully conscious, because we're not getting a measure of consciousness qua consciousness. We're getting a measure of how well our interface lets us get access to the consciousness that's already there. So that's why this is not just abstract stuff. This cuts into hospital settings and whether we want to pull the plug. If I'm right, if this and integrated information theory is effectively just a theory of the pixels of a space-time, entities inside space-time, which is just a data structure, it's only measuring our access to the conscious, how much we can see of the conscious. It's not measuring the exact reality of the consciousness, only our access to it. That distinction makes all the difference in the world as to whether you want to use it in a medical setting to decide life and death.
That's such an important point. That's such an important point that there is this implicit assumption out there that, well, when you get to the lower levels, we're right to be confused because the dynamics aren't worked out and there are these complex, exotic mathematics that we don't know of. But when we scale high enough into complexity, we can be confident to use our methods and make claims about medicine or psychology or economics. But that's not the case. Scaling doesn't get rid of the problem.
That's right. And as long as we understand that we're like with neuroscience, that we're dealing with the user interface, so that the neurons that we see are the neurons that we render when we look, and then we understand that there's a much more complicated reality behind the neurons or behind our biology. If we understand that, we can use the neurons. And I've collaborated and worked on MRI, fMRI, and EEG studies. I'm all for neuroscience. I mean, I think we need more work in neuroscience and so forth, not less. But we have to be very, very careful and realize that we can't just take those things at face value. We really have to go much more deeply on them. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Picking up on something you talked about earlier, um, one thing that's really puzzling is this transition between empty, what you call being or empty consciousness, consciousness not realized, to going to any kind of organization of consciousness. That's such a puzzling problem. Do you have thoughts as to how that happens?
The way we're doing it is we have this mathematical model we call a conscious agent, and we can talk about very simple conscious agents that, a conscious agent might only have one experience. Like this agent only sees red. That's all it can experience. And another agent only experiences green, and so forth. And then we can look at how they interact. And it's a theorem of our mathematics that when two agents interact, or even just when you have two agents or n agents, those n agents also are an agent. That just follows from the mathematical definition of an agent. They satisfy the definition, so they are an agent. That means if I say I start off with a countable set of agents, countable set being like this, the infinity of the integers, 1, 2, 3, up through infinity. That's the smallest infinity. What mathematicians call A left 0, the smallest infinity. So suppose we start off with a bunch of simple agents and we have A left 0 infinity of them. Well, our theory says that any subset of those agents is also an agent. So that means we have to look at all possible subsets. That's called the power set. So you look at the collection of all subsets of a set, that's called the power set. Well, the power set of the infinity A left 0 is a new infinity. It's a higher infinity called A left 1. So it's a much bigger infinity. And then all those agents take their power set, we get A left 2, and then A left 3. And so our theory makes a very clear prediction that there's one agent, because whenever you have any agents, they also are an agent. So in some sense, our theory says, yes, there is one agent, and only one agent, if you wish. On the other hand, it says, but you cannot describe that agent, because to describe it, you would have to go all the way up Cantor's hierarchy. This is called Cantor's hierarchy of all these infinities. So we're supposed that, in 100 years, we're at A left 5 billion. Well, amazing. Wow, we've gone up 5 billion levels of infinity, and we've studied all the possible combinations of conscious agents up to that level and understand their properties. Incredible time to break out the champagne. But our mathematics is there saying, great accomplishment, but you have to go to infinity. Cantor's hierarchy has infinite number of levels, so you'll never get there. So some people might say, why don't you start with a theory of the one, and then just show how all of our consciousnesses are projections of that one? And I wish I could, but we can't. It's mathematically impossible. You can't do it. And so, but that's just no surprise, because as we talked about before, there is no scientific theory of everything. There is no scientific theory that could explain everything. You can only explain everything except the assumptions of your theory. And a new theory that explains those assumptions will have its own assumptions ad infinitum. So the nice thing, what I like about scientific theories, a good scientific theory is mathematically explicit and says explicitly what the limits of that theory are. In our case, the theory will say, you got to A left 5 trillion, congratulations, you only have an infinite number of hierarchies left in Cantor's hierarchy to go. It tells you exactly its limit, the limits of what you've done so far. And that's what you really want, is for a theory to tell you its limit. That's a good cure for dogmatism.
And your theory also doesn't posit anything about selfhood, right? Selfhood or identity or memory or all the other sort of elementary cognitive properties that people put into the downscaled version of these things.
That's a good point. So also in the spirit of Occam's razor, where you want to have as few assumptions as possible, essentially our only assumptions are that there are conscious experiences and that they probabilistically influence the probability of other conscious experiences happening. That's it. So there is, as you said, no notion of self, learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, and so forth. But it's trivial with our Markovian dynamics of conscious agents where the Markovian dynamics is how conscious experiences probabilistically affect the occurrence of other probabilistic experiences. So it's a Markovian dynamics. So with that dynamics, it's trivial to show that it's computationally universal. So anything you can do with neural networks, you can do with networks of conscious agents. So we can build, so even though it's only started off with very simple assumptions of experiences, of influencing experiences, if you want, you can build up a theory of self or learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, all that stuff. You can do that. But it's not limited to computation. The measurable sets on which the Markovian kernels are defined need not be computable sets. And so so we're not limited to computation. So it's so yeah. I think that you want your theory to force you to do all that work. If I had a theory of consciousness that said, well, and so I'm assuming not only experiences and probabilistic influences, but also a self and learning and memory and problem solving, and all these things are part of my assumptions. Well, then I've got my own stipulation. I mean, I just made a big deal about the stipulation problem of consciousness for all my brilliant colleagues, right? They're stipulating space-time, they're stipulating IIT. Then they have to stipulate the conscious experiences that are associated with it. They're stipulating everything. Well, I don't want to stipulate everything. But you have to stipulate something. So you have to stipulate the absolute minimum. And so we're trying to be absolute minimum conscious experiences and probabilistic influences among them, and then boot up everything. And then once we boot up consciousness, project it down to decorated permutations and show how space-time is just a user interface that some conscious agents employ to interact with other conscious agents. But it's one of countless interfaces. This is not anything special. There are countless interfaces you could use. Space-time just happens to be one. So it's not the final reality. It's just one kind of headset for a particular kind of game. That's all.
Right. So, sorry, this is going a bit into left field here, but then do you imagine that cognition or the mixed bag of cognitive properties just kind of emerge somewhere, or do you see these cognitive properties as also being somehow deeply related to these structures?
So, when I teach a big class in intro to psych, I'll often say a standard thing in cognitive neuroscience that 90+% of our mental processes are unconscious. Right? So you have billions of neurons and lots of stuff going on, a lot of mental processes, but most of it's unconscious. And so I've said that many times in my classes, but strictly speaking, it's not true. Right? It may not be conscious to me. I might be aware, but right now, for example, I'm not directly aware of Ashar's conscious experiences. I'm not conscious of them. Does that mean that Ashar is not conscious? No, it means that I don't have access. The consciousness is there. I don't have access to it. So the cognitive processes that you're talking about, that I and my colleagues call unconscious processes, they're not, strictly speaking, unconscious processes. They're just not conscious to me. But that doesn't mean that they're unconscious simpliciter. And in a theory in which I say, assume that consciousness is fundamental and conscious agents is a model of it, so that's my fundamental reality, then consciousness is fundamental. And if so, my space-time headset that I'm using right now, it gives me insight into your consciousness through your face. With my cat, I get good insight, some insight through my cat icon. An ant icon gives me less insight. An amoeba icon gives me almost none, and a rock icon is giving me no insight into the consciousness behind. By hypothesis, I'm always interacting with consciousness. Not consciousness is in space-time, right? There's not a consciousness in the rock. There's not a consciousness in my body. Consciousness is entirely outside of space-time. It's not in my brain. It's not in my body. It's not in your body. These are just merely headset symbols. So it's entirely outside of space-time. So the distinction we make between living and non-living things in space-time, or conscious and non-conscious things, it's not principled. Those distinctions, there is no principled distinction between living and non-living. It's an artifact of the limitations of our user interface. A user interface has to give up. That's what it's for. It's there to simplify things. So at some point, it doesn't reveal the consciousness to you anymore, right? With Ashkar, it's giving me, Ashar's base is giving me some. With CAD, it's giving me some. With a rock, it's giving me none. Well, that's what an interface does. It gives up. So I'm not saying a rock is conscious. Nothing inside space-time is conscious. Nothing. Space-time itself is just a headset.
Right. I mean, just even by asking that question about the emergence of cognition, I've already snuck in stuff about space-time that isn't principally founded yet, and already messed up the question.
That's why your question was great. I mean, it forces out this really important distinction. I mean, so it's a great question.
Okay, a bit of shifting gears a little bit. You mentioned meditation earlier. What are your thoughts about the spiritual contemplative traditions, and have they aided in the search at all?
So there's, I'm saying that space-time isn't fundamental, and that right now I'm thinking about a scientific theory in which consciousness is fundamental. And there are many spiritual traditions that will say, well, you're late to the party. We've been saying this kind of thing for thousands of years. Buddhism, Hinduism, mystical Christianity, mystical Islam, mystical Judaism. I mean, there and probably many others that I don't know about. So there's the mystical traditions in all these various directions have been saying similar things. And so I think that my attitude is I want to listen to what they have to say in the same way that I listen to my colleagues in the sciences, which is with respect and healthy skepticism, right? Both. That's just so. So I think that they have some really important insights that I want to learn from, and I suspect, just like in science, we make mistakes. I expect that some of their ideas in certain ways of putting up things are not helpful, and they may be misguided. So I want to learn from them, and then I think what ultimately I want is an interaction between science and spirituality. I think that they have two pieces of the puzzle, and a collaboration could be useful because scientists have developed the tools of mathematical precision in theories and precise experimental tests of those theories. And that really is important because two things. Your theories are smarter than you. In science, when Einstein wrote down his field equations for general relativity, he didn't know about black holes. He didn't believe in black holes. His equations taught him that there are black holes. Now, when you just do things in English or whatever your language is, it's very rare sometimes, but it's very rare that you're going to get that kind of tutoring from what you wrote down. I mean, again, think about what tutoring that Einstein got. Black holes, that's pretty specific learning that you're getting from your theory. I mean, Einstein started off with people in falling elevators and standing on weights, and the mathematics comes back and says, by the way, your thought experiments mean that there are black holes. Holy smoke. I mean, so when you do these mathematically precise theories, you get this incredible payoff that you become the student of your theory, and the theory takes you places that your own ideas need to go, but you didn't know it. But second, the scientific theories also tell you the limits. They say this theory is good up to this point, and then it fails. And that's what we don't. So we don't have those two things in the spiritual traditions. We don't have the precision that will come back and slap you in the face and say, here's where your own theory tutors you. And we don't have this antidote to dogmatism. I mean, scientists are people, so scientists are just as dogmatic as anybody. But when your theories come back, and someone else, maybe I won't use my own theory to show I'm wrong, but my friend will. My scientific colleagues will be happy to use my theories to show me the limits of my ideas. So that's the antidote to dogmatism, And so what I would love that in the spiritual traditions as well. So the spiritual traditions they talk about having what they say be thought of as pointers, not the truth, The Tao Te Ching starts off by saying the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. Absolutely right. But then you have to go on and speak, and then the rest of the book carries on after that. So you have pointers, and but now you know that the pointers all have limits. Well, okay, what are the limits of this pointer? How far should I take it seriously, and when should I let go? And you don't get that with just language, typically. You do get that with mathematical precision. So the mathematical precision would be very, very helpful. But second, often spirituality, as we have seen many times, degenerates into religiosity. And people will kill each other because your pointers are different from mine. I think Jesus is the way, and you say Buddha is the way, and so we're going to fight and kill and so forth. And so having clear pointers that can teach you, but then also having pointers that show you their own limits so that the dogmatism doesn't come up, and we don't end up killing each other because I believe this pointer and you don't believe this pointer. Well, if the pointer itself said, don't believe me beyond this point, then we wouldn't have to fight over it because the pointer itself would be saying, don't do this, don't do this. This pointer only goes this far. So I think that would be a wonderful way to stop the fights and have a more profitable collaboration. So I see science and spirituality really being able to help each other. But of course, there's a bad history since Galileo, at least. The church, the Catholic Church at the time, put him under house arrest, threatened him with physical harm because he disbelieved things that the church believed that have turned out to be patently false. The church believed things that were patently false. So as a result, scientists have said if that's what religion is, then no, thank you. And so we need to now move beyond and go to the place where we can have a profitable dialogue. And it's going to require both sides to make compromises in the sense that, on the religious side, there may be pointers that you're deeply attached to that may turn out to be extremely shallow pointers. They're not that deep, and you really need some deeper pointers. And on the science side, well, for scientists, letting go of space-time, hey, that's a new trick. It's not a very comfortable trick, and most scientists, most of my colleagues in neuroscience, are not happy with it. So there's something on the scientists have some big adjustments as well. So, but I'm sanguine. I think that my generation probably won't get it, but the younger generation will start to get it. My generation just has to die, but the new generation will begin to forge these new links between the good parts of science and the good parts of spirituality. And I think it'll be for the benefit of all humanity.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, the political problems I don't think are trivial. They seem very
Right.
difficult to overcome. Yeah, just historical contingencies, bad blood. Yeah, and I mean, somehow there's somewhat a principal reason for them as well, right? Like, I think at least in my recent and very very limited practice of spiritual practices, there really is a personal emphasis on it. Like, I can gain a lot of it. I can gain a lot from just personally sitting and reflecting every day, or just meditating in silence.
Yes.
But I have no idea how to scale that to a social relationship or a political citizenship or my role as an economic actor. I have no idea how to link those things together. And in some senses, if you're forming movements, those questions are important. They need to be dealt with.
Yeah. So no, I agree. I think that of course it starts with the individual as you are doing, and in some sense, unless you yourself are centered, unless you are in some sense have let go of ego and let go of identification with your physical form and your status in the world and your need to compete and be important and to the extent that and you have to be right and everybody else has to be wrong. it's only to the extent that I have begun to let go of that I can be a positive influence. Otherwise, everything I do organizationally to try to get people to, can we all get along? If I haven't let go of my own ego, then I'm tainted at the source, and everything I do will be tainted all the way through. So there's I think no substitute for individuals letting go and doing what you're talking about, which is meditating and letting go of the egoic need to be right and you wrong and all the stuff that leads to the wonderful theory of evolutionary psychology, right? Evolutionary psychology wonderfully documents all of our problems here, and all the strategies that we use to one up each other and so forth. So evolutionary psychology is the correct scientific theory of the false self, as the spiritual traditions call it. That it is, but I think the spiritual traditions are right that there is um, the false self is just an illusion that we've bought into, and as we let go of the illusion, then we can be guides or helps or whatever to others to let go of the illusion. Um, and I think ultimately that's one of the things I'm hoping for in this rapprochement between science and spirituality is that it will facilitate this, that it will become scientifically clear that the false self is a false self. It'll become clear that, yeah, evolutionary psychology correctly describes how we will behave and feel when we're identified with the false self. But there is a deeper psychology that transcends that. And that is, as human beings and as scientists, it is in our best interest to go there. For example, for me as a scientist, all of my scientific theories, all scientific theories are conceptual, right? We write down mathematics, we write down words, they're all conceptual. But we know from Gödel's incompleteness theorem that any formal theory leaves out countless truths. Gödel proved you have this really fancy mathematical theory. He can always show you a statement that's true but can't be proven within your theory. And if you add that statement to your theory, then he'll show you a new statement that's true and can't be proven. And so that's pointing to an unbounded intelligence beyond any conceptual intelligence that we have, beyond any and that's us. That I mean, I think the spiritual traditions are right on this. The mathematical work that I'm doing on consciousness seems to point in that direction. That there is this one consciousness. We're not divorced from it. You and I are it, and we are projections of that one consciousness. And so, in meditation, when you actually go into silence and you really let go of your conceptions, you are actually opening up to this infinite intelligence that's really you. And that infinite intelligence has all possibility for opening up new fields of science, as well as new fields of cooperation, politically, emotionally, spiritually. So as we learn from science itself, and like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that stepping out of our theories and stepping into utter silence is actually not stupid. It's actually what our best science suggests is the right way to proceed. If we want to have the deepest ideas and the deepest contact with other people who are just the same as me, the one consciousness under a different avatar. So in other words, as science and spirituality really integrate, spirituality will lose many of the wrong bells and whistles that it has, but the deep insights will still be there, and science will grab onto those. And I think it will lead us to realize that, yes, we need, when we're doing linguistic or conceptual things, we want absolute precision. No messing around. We want falsifiable theories, no BS. But then, if you want deep intelligence, let go of all of your theories. Go into absolute silence, and that's also where you'll get in deepest touch on a human level with other people and see them for who they are, which is just the one consciousness under a different guise. And so I see this rapprochement as a healing, like you mentioned, politics, where our politics is polarized right now in many places in the world. And again, in many cases, because my pointers are different from yours, and you don't believe my religious pointers and so forth. So the stuff we're talking about is not just theoretical; it cuts on politics today. So I see a rapprochement and a real moving forward where we will learn to, as Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, because your neighbor is yourself. And you really see that not just as some platitude that some guy said 2,000 years ago. You see it as the deepest insight that's compatible with our best science. There is just the one consciousness, and to love your neighbor as yourself is really to love yourself. And when you do that, when you really take that to heart, then you're much less likely to, be ragging on your neighbor because of differences in politics, or killing your neighbor because of differences in religion. So
Do you think that in some sense this process will have to be conscious, like that we consciously have to bridge that gap? Because I mean, we can understand why you'd go the other way, right? Evolutionary dynamics, market dynamics, political theory tell us that if you do science with cutthroat brutal competition and just let competition